Thank you everyone for taking the time to be with us today. And we would like to welcome each of you to our webinar, Online Learning and Bloom's Taxonomy, Interaction at All Levels, which is presented today by Dr. Vanessa Dennen, who is our guest speaker from Florida State University, which is also my alumni. In this presentation of this webinar, you will learn about how Bloom's taxonomy can guide the selection and design of online learning activities. Dr. Dennen will present examples of engaging activities and assessments that take advantage of online learning tools, along with ideas of how to support learners as they attain lower, middle, and higher order learning outcomes. So we are very privileged to have you, Dr. Dennen, with us today. And I'll just give you all a little bit of a background about Dr. Vanessa Dennen. Apart from her being one of my professors from Florida State University, she teaches courses on research and instructional design for online and emerging technologies. She currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the Internet and Higher Education. Her research investigates instructional design and learner engagement in online discussion activities, knowledge management, and knowledge brokering within online networks and communities of practice, and also social media use in the school context. Dr. Dennen has authored more than 100 published articles and chapters which have appeared in journals and books such as Instructional Science, Distance Education, Computers in Human Behavior, Teachers College Record, Educational Research Technology and Development, the Handbook of Distance Education, and the Handbook of Research on Educational Communications and Technology. And you can find more information about Dr. Vanessa Dennen at vanessadennen.com. That's VANESSADENNEN.com. And I will also send you all the link to Dr. Dennen's profile on this chat, on the chat thread right here. So you are able to view all of her information. So thank you so much, Dr. Dennen, for being here with us today and your time. Before Dr. Dennen begins her presentation for this webinar, we're just going to run a quick poll. We would appreciate your input on this poll. It's just a short, a couple of questions that we would like to have your input from. So please give us your information on the poll. And there you can scroll down for the second question because there are more options available. So if everybody has had the chance to submit their poll, I'll give everybody a couple of more seconds to complete the poll. And then we can begin this webinar. So if everybody has a chance, I think I'll hand over the floor to you, Dr. Dennen.
Okay, thank you very much. Should I end the poll formally here myself?
Well, you're free to do so.
Okay, I'll go ahead and hit end poll here and share the results with everybody so they can see those for a second. You can see that there are a lot of people here today who are working in some sort of instructional capacity as instructor or faculty, but I see we've also got some folks who are staff as well as researchers. So hopefully something here, this is very focused on instruction, but hopefully there's something of interest to the researchers as well. And I see that we've got, it looks like about 2/3 of the folks are from a 2-year college and the remainder from university or other. So that's, a pretty broad range of people here today. That's great. So what I am here to talk about today is online learning, which is something that so many of us have been pushed into during the past year, whether it was our choice or just a matter of the interesting circumstances of 2020. That's quite a way to put it, isn't it? And Bloom's taxonomy, which is a really helpful thing to use when you are trying to design an online course, and make sure that you're really doing what is necessary to help meet your learners' needs. And it can be a variety of needs that our learners have. Now, I'm bringing to this conversation today not only my experiences as a researcher, but I have been teaching online, well, I like to say since the last century, because it just sounds so big, doesn't it? But I have been teaching online for that long, for as long as I've been teaching at the university level. So I have a lot of practical experience, and I've been teaching at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level, doing a lot of professional development online as well. I do have my contact information on here, and I invite anybody to get in touch at any point if you've got questions or follow-up brainstorming or anything like that. I also do a pretty good job when I am presenting like this at following things that are happening in the chat and being able to respond to some of those in the midst. And I'll even ask you to type into the chat for me, so please don't hesitate to do that, although we will have some time for deeper Q&A at the end of this session. But I have planned for a little bit of engagement with you along the way. What I want to focus on in this first part while I'm presenting today is how do we design online learning activities to meet student outcomes. It's really important that we are hitting the mark when we move online. And I know that that's where a lot of people struggle when they move online, because we may have been doing something in a campus setting for a long time, and then we shift online and it's like, how do I do that? How do I make that happen now? Everything feels like it's changed, but we still want to achieve the same outcomes that we did before. And sometimes that requires that we really rethink our courses. Now, the good news about this is especially if you're somebody who is moving online because of the pandemic and has every plan to move themselves back offline again as soon as they possibly can. The good news about this is the efforts that are put into learning how to be a good online course designer and a good online instructor comes back and has benefits on what you do in the face-to-face setting. Everybody who I've worked with over the years has said that, because they've had to rethink their practices and their courses, and they reap the benefits of having done that, having questioned their pedagogy, their assumptions, and everything they've used over the years. So we'll talk a little bit about online learning concerns, learner interactions, Bloom's taxonomy, and then how this drives online learning activity design. So online learning concerns, these are some of the big ones that I see. If you have some particular ones, feel free to drop them in the chat right now. But I find that a lot of the concerns that people articulate to me when they're moving online fall along one of these 3 lines. One is handling transactional distance, which is a fancy term for a very simple concept, and I'm going to go into that in just a moment. So if you don't know what transactional distance is, don't worry about that just yet. How do I even identify and address my learning outcomes? I may know what my learning outcomes are, but I have no idea how to address them in this online setting. And what pedagogical strategies or activities should I be using? And I see there's a question here about talking about how poorly K-12 students have performed. Let's save that for the discussion afterwards, because I think that's a great topic, and I'd really be happy to go into that topic with you. I have some definite thoughts about that. But this idea of bridging the distance, meeting the learning outcomes, and finding appropriate pedagogical strategies is really important. And I see we've got a concern about teaching technical hands-on skills virtually. We can talk about that as we work through some examples today. So this concept of transactional distance that I mentioned a moment ago is, if you just take a look at the words, which is true of most of the fancy terms we use in education, right? Transaction, what is that? Like, that's some sort of an exchange between one or two or more people. And distance, we perceive that there's distance. So when we are transacting, we perceive that there is a distance. We don't perceive very much distance when we are in a face-to-face instructional setting, particularly in small classes, right? You get everybody seated in a circle together, and we get a sense of who everybody else is. We notice everything that's going on. We feel very little transactional distance. If we're in a big lecture hall, well, the instructor at the front of the room may not see all of the students that clearly. The students may feel like they're somewhat invisible in there, so there's a greater transactional distance. We get on a Zoom like this, so technology is going to broaden all of that distance. Right now I'm looking at a PowerPoint slide and I'm talking to a group of people. I see a couple of names up in boxes, some with some profile photos up there, but mostly I'm just sitting here talking to my computer right now. Right? There's some distance there. How about if we go into discussion activities and we're just, typing away, and we don't even know if somebody else is there to read it on the other side. So there's even more transactional distance. So the technology that we use broadens it, but there are interaction techniques that we can use to try to lessen it. And with what we do in online instruction is really try to lessen that transactional distance. But when I talk to people who are going to be new at this, that's one of the things that they mention right away. They can't see their learners, they can't hear their learners, they're not sure that their learners see and hear and sense them all that clearly either. So I'd like to learn a little bit more about some of you, which is, what activities are you doing in your face-to-face classes normally? What types of things do you do? Are you lecturing? Are you discussing? Are you demonstrating? I've got this already that we've got some hands-on skills that are happening. Type some of the stuff that you do in the chat for me so we can get a sense of each other and the learning activities that we do. I'll give you 60 seconds. I'll have a sip of water here. Okay, so we've got some flip charts and brainstorming together, pairing students up for discussion, lectures, case studies, hands-on stuff, Kahoot. Lots of people are using Kahoot online right now, Q&A sessions. Okay, breakout groups, small groups face-to-face, breakout groups on Zoom, all works. I was going to say pretty much the same. There are some small differences in doing that. Clickers. Yeah, so we've got a pretty wide range of things that people are doing. And I see that some of them are focused on disseminating information to learners. Some of them are focused on having learners engage in some sort of practice or articulation, getting them to talk, getting them to share their ideas, perhaps getting them to evaluate different things. And in most classes, we are doing multiple of these things at the same time. So when we think about learner interactions, we need to think about them broadly. There are a lot of things out there that our learners could be interacting with. There's the content that we have for the course. And, content doesn't always sound like the most interactive thing, but learners do interact with the content. And that's important for us to remember. When they engage with it, sometimes they have internal dialogues in their head with the content, even if there's no other type of interaction that's taking place. They interact with the computer. We can build in quizzes, things that give them some automated feedback. There may be this combination of content and computer interaction that's taking place. The instructor, and if we're synchronous or asynchronous, whether we're in real time or not in real time, that changes the nature of the interactions that instructors can have with their learners. Now, peer interactions get a little more tricky too, don't they, when we get online? So we worry about, do people, if we're synchronous, if we're on Zoom, we worry about, do people have their cameras on? Are they still there? If I put them in a breakout room, did they actually all go to the breakout room? Did they do what they were supposed to do when they were in the breakout room? I'm not watching them. Of course, you have the same problem in a face-to-face classroom. You break them into small groups. And, unless you're standing there with that small group at that moment, you never know if they're really entirely on task or not. When we are doing things not in real time, when we're doing them asynchronously, getting those interactions to happen can be a little bit more challenging. And I think it's really important that we also consider network interactions. And that's not something that you find in quite as much of the research literature, but those of us who do work with social media and learning are trying to push the idea of that a little bit more, because whether you sanction it or not, most of your students will go to Google and start looking things up. Most of your students will go and ask the people who they know around them for help with something. And that's interacting outside of the class with the broader network of the internet, as well as the network of people that the students know. And I love this comment here about randomly visiting breakout rooms. That can be really important to let students know that you're there during the activity. You didn't walk away and take a break. And it's useful to help them along the way. So let's keep in mind our learner interactions. There are lots of ways that they could be interacting and engaging. And then we've got the tools that we have. And so these are typical kinds of tools that we would have at our disposal, whether they're embedded directly in our learning management system, or if there's something else that we use and we just try to connect it into that. Okay, so we've got content linking and hosting. We use Canvas at my university, right? I can host some content and I can link all sorts of content. I can go to videos that are on YouTube. I can put up PDFs of readings. I can type in my own lecture notes for my students, give them a PowerPoint, lots of content. We have quiz and testing tools, and they're not just for quizzes and tests. That's the kind of tool that it is. But basically, they are places where people can check off boxes or can enter little bits of text, and it can get sent off to the instructor, and then something else can happen with it. Usually we use it for quizzes and tests, but there may be other reasons why we want to use them. The same thing with discussion boards, because it's easy to say, oh, discuss, but there's no singular thing that really is discussion. There are lots of different ways that we can use discussion boards as a tool. There are lots of different ways of doing discussion. Just off the top of my head, I could use a discussion board to ask my students to contribute items to develop a classroom knowledge base. I could ask them to use it to engage in brainstorming. They could use it to engage in peer critique of work. We could use it to start to dissect some readings that we've worked with. We could use it as a space where students are bringing examples to the classroom space and then dissecting the student generated examples. So there's so many ways to use discussion boards. Synchronous video discussion like Zoom, or asynchronous video discussion like Flipgrid. And if you're not familiar with Flipgrid, it does have a Canvas integration, and it's available for everybody to use for free. So if you want to have video-based discussion, but you don't have synchronous learners, it's a great tool to use for that. And then we also have to break down the activities, think about them in terms of which ones are going to be individual, which ones are going to be synchronous, and if they're synchronous, are we involving the whole class or small group, and which ones are going to be asynchronous, like in a discussion board, and again, are we going to use the whole class or put it down to a small group level? And I'm going through all of this because I want to broaden out all of these dimensions. There are a lot of choices for us to make, and I think it can get kind of overwhelming. At least at my university, in the initial transition to remote, what a lot of instructors were being told was to just take what you do and do it on Zoom, right? You're used to doing things synchronously in the face-to-face classroom. Now just go do it on Zoom. And yeah, it's not all going to work perfectly, but go with it. Now that we're getting further in, people are starting to rethink the way that they are teaching their classes, and to more fully explore the tools that are available to them and the types of interactions and the types of learning activities that they might want to do with their students. One other thing I wanted to bring in, because I knew that this idea of doing some hands-on and really concrete demonstration types of learning activities would be of concern to this audience today, is Dale's cone of experience. Now, if you've heard of Dale's cone before, it's sometimes misused, it's sometimes maligned. There have been people who have taken this cone of experience and tried to apply something that is not empirically based to it, saying people remember X% of what they hear and so on. That stuff, there's no actual science behind it. But Edgar Dale put together this cone of experience to encourage people to think about the way that we engage learners in a classroom setting, based on how direct or indirect and abstract that learning experience is. I think this is useful for us as we move ourselves online, because in our classrooms, we might regularly be using demonstrations, or we might have students who are engaged in field experiences. There might be presentations and exhibits, and it's challenging to figure out how you're going to move some of those things online. When we talk about online learning, a lot of people default to, like, I'm just going to use discussion boards, or I'm just going to get on a Zoom and talk at somebody. And then we're getting up into these symbolic experiences that are up at the top of Dale's cone of experience. And it's learning through abstraction. It's really difficult for people who are new to a topic to figure out what is going on when they're taught at the level of abstraction. So the more direct and concrete we can make the learning experience, especially when we are introducing a new topic. Note that I didn't say when we're working with novices, but rather when we're introducing a new topic to people, the more concrete we can be, the better the learning is. And I make that point about it not just being about novices, but recognizing that we're all novice at something at some point in time. When we talk about little kids, we do all this hands-on learning, but adults need that same kind of concrete hands-on learning when they're learning to do something new. Like, I don't know if any of you out there are knitters. I have tried to learn knitting many times, and the downfall for me is I don't have anybody to sit there with me and to go through it and to show me what to do with my hands. And then I look at I look at images of it and I'm just lost. I can't get my hands in the same position. It's not three-dimensional. It's not working. And then when I read directions just on like how to knit something, I feel like people are talking a different language because it's up at the top of that cone and it's really super abstract at that point. So there are so many options. How do we choose what we're going to do? Well, I'm encouraging us all to think about how we use Bloom's taxonomy to start to drive this decision. Have any of you used Bloom's taxonomy before? If you let me know in the chat if it's something that you have used before or if it's new to you. It's for people coming out of the K-12 world, it's usually pretty familiar. In higher education, sometimes it gets used, sometimes it doesn't get used so much. But the idea behind Bloom's taxonomy is just that learning outcomes and activities have been categorized from those that are called lower order ones to higher order ones. And we usually hear lower order to higher order, but I'm going to take a pause and also get at middle order today, which is a distinction that isn't made often enough, but I think really does need to be made. I'm going to walk through it bit by bit. So, don't worry about that. This is not the only slide. This is just a pretty visual of Bloom's taxonomy. And if you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, it has been revised since the 1950s when it was originally created. The only difference in the revision is the top parts of it just got flip-flopped as people started rethinking what truly was the higher order skills. So I may be going through things in a slightly unfamiliar order to you or changing the names a little bit from the way that you originally learned them, but it's all pretty much the same. It's not worth worrying about. So Bloom's taxonomy, why use Bloom's taxonomy? It's really important because it helps you break down the instruction into the little parts and figure out what is it that your learners actually need to do. And that all leads to this idea of instructional alignment, which is so important for anybody who's going to design instruction. Right? The learning objectives should be dictating the learning activities, which should lead to making the learners successful on the assessments. So all of those need to be aligned or need to be matching with each other. And I see in the chat that we've got somebody who uses the action words to develop their course objectives. Exactly. And if you had a big push at your institution on articulating your learning objectives, somebody's probably given you a handout of Bloom's taxonomy and said, here, pick your objectives from this. And I encourage everybody then to not let it sit at the level of objectives, but to take it a step further and really allow it to drive the entire instructional experience. So with that in mind, I'm going to start walking us through Bloom's taxonomy and the different order of skills. Then we've got the lower order skills. So it's sitting at the bottom, we've got remember, and that's just recognizing or recalling facts. And this is even if you are doing more sophisticated things with your learners, right? If they don't know the terms and the concepts that you're working with, they can't do anything else successfully. So at some level, they need to be able to recognize or recall facts. And then stepping up to understand, they need to be able to understand those facts and ideas. That's all of your foundational knowledge, right? If we're not using the same terms and the same definitions for things, nothing's going to work. The understanding part deepens the remember part. You've probably had experiences with learners who have memorized a definition of something. Oh, I once had somebody get really angry at me on a test because they had memorized the definitions of everything exactly the way they appeared in the textbook. And I did not ask the questions so that they had the exact definitions that were in the textbooks, but I paraphrased. And that's because I was trying to assess them up at a higher order than just remember. I have a question here about the difference between an activity and an assessment. So the activity is what you do to learn something. It's the practice that you might engage in. And the assessment then is what the instructor does to evaluate the learning. In some classes, the activity and the assessment may be one and the same, but in a lot of instances, they are different things. So those of you who are talking about like, oh, there might be some lecture and then there might be a small group activity. Okay, so the lecture is one kind of activity that disseminates information to the class. And then the small group discussion or problem solving that students would engage in, that's another form of activity. And eventually your students will take a test, write a paper, do a presentation, and that might be your assessment for the class. I hope that clears up that question. If it doesn't, let me know. So these are our lower order skills. Are there any of you who teach lower order skills and that's where it ends? Because we have a lot of classes that do that. And this is where a lot of people then struggle when they get online and they think about how am I going to get people interacting? Right? Because I don't need learners to discuss the definition of something. The definition is what it is. It's fact-based and there's not much discussion to be had. And the tension of this is that discussion is good online, not just pedagogically speaking, but because it makes people get invested and get involved, and that has some motivational sense of belonging, learning community type implications. That's the stuff that helps people keep logging into class because they feel like they'll be missing something or they will be missed if they're not there and if they don't show up. Now I'm going to shift to the middle order skills. Apply and analyze. So, applying is taking the stuff that we just covered with lower order skills, the remember and understand stuff, and being able to figure out where it fits in the real world. So using those knowledge and skills in a new situation. Again, I've got some verbs there that might be associated with it. If you're doing some hands-on work with your students, if you probably are working at least at the apply level, certainly when you're first working through the knowledge and skills with your students, you're getting them to apply. But if you don't use the same terminology underneath things, so I'm going to go back to the slide, right? If your students don't remember, like, what is this part called and what does it do? If they can't do that, then how are they going to be able to effectively demonstrate something, right? And they might be able to remember enough to parrot back your demonstration, but as soon as they get something that's a new situation that's slightly different, it will fall apart if they don't have that remember and understand part in place. So then we get to apply and analyze. So analyze, we're really starting to take things apart. We deconstruct it, we reorganize it, we test things. And finally, we get to higher order skills. And we don't always get to higher order skills in every class. Some classes purport to focus only on higher order skills, but in a foundational sense, they need to go back to those lower and middle order skills. Because if your students don't have that knowledge mastered at the lower and the middle order level, then getting them to do higher order stuff doesn't work so well. And this is one of those challenges we hit with online instruction, where people might gravitate towards doing the learning activities that focus on higher order skills because we're told, like, oh, you need to engage your students in these robust discussions. But what you're trying to teach your students and what you need them to practice is actually lower order skills. And when there's a mismatch there, I watch classes just disintegrate because it doesn't work. So identifying what you're trying to teach, what's the highest level, and also what are all of the enabling parts, that's going to be really important. So evaluate, it's making informed judgments, and creating is modifying something that already exists or making something new, but there's a lot of investment that we get in that. It's much more sophisticated than applying. If we go back to the middle order for a second, right, that's just applying and analyzing. You can think about how you need to be able to just apply in a regular situation, but then if you want to make something new, right, it's really elevating it up a level. If you cook things on a regular basis, you could probably follow one recipe and you could start to follow another recipe, but to create a new recipe altogether means building on all of that foundational knowledge of cooking and putting it in a new realm, right? Like if I wanted to come up with a new way of making cake, like that's going to be hard. I need to understand a whole lot about what happens underneath and the reactions between the the flour and the baking powder and everything else that goes in there. So as we think about the levels of objectives, we will have whatever our course level objectives, and then we will have enabling objectives. And of those enabling objectives, we have to make the determination of what are prerequisites, what do we think our learners knew already, and what are we teaching in the course. And so what we need to do with Bloom's taxonomy, and then it goes back to like, what are my learning interactions going to be? What are the learning tools I'm going to use to achieve all of this? What we need to do is to identify all of the enabling objectives and the course level objectives and make sure that we are providing sufficient interaction, sufficient activities for our students at that appropriate level of Bloom's taxonomy to reach that eventual course level outcome that we want. So I like to start with the objective and say, what's the verb? And then I go to my activity level and I say, so how can students practice doing this? And ideally, the assessment that I have is students showing me that they can do this. Sometimes we engage in what's called backwards design, which means that we have the assessment and it's a given. We know that this is what we're teaching to. So who cares what the objectives were? They're kind of implied in the assessment. And then we design backward from the assessment and figure out what types of learning interactions and practice opportunities and content and all that our students need to engage in. Do we have anybody here today who has courses that are driven by some ultimate kind of assessment, and they may not be the assessments that, I see we have a comment, it's not your understanding of backwards design. It's not always starting directly with an assessment. Sometimes backwards design is starting with this idea, what do you want learners to be able to do at the end? But yeah, it's working backwards from the process rather than sitting down and just saying, here's my learning objective and moving forward from the whole process. But ideally, in an aligned instruction world, it's all the same because it matches. So whether you're starting from your assessment or starting from your objectives, they're going to be the same thing. Your assessment will reflect your objectives. But in a lot of cases, what happens is there could be a departmental exam that you're working towards. So you weren't really in charge of that in your own class, or there could be some sort of industry level exam that you're working toward here. Actually, I saw blinging across my screen as I've been talking here that my sister just found out that she passed the bar exam in Massachusetts. Yay! That bar exam drove everything, right? In law school, that's what they were working towards. So designing backwards from something like that. Another way that I like to think about this is the cognitive apprenticeship model. And I see we've got nursing as an example there. Yeah, nursing is a great example. A fabrication course, starting with what they do in industry and work backwards. That's what it's all about. So the cognitive apprenticeship model also helps us think about whether our learners need to engage in reception type of learning or metacognition or transfer to a higher level. So if it's reception learning, and you've talked about already on the chat, like, got to do hands-on stuff. So you probably demonstrate in a face-to-face classroom for your learners. Now you can think about, how do I bring that demonstration to my learners in an online setting? Do I want to do a recorded video for them? Does that work for everybody? Do I demonstrate it live while we're on Zoom together and allow them to interact with me? Because then they can ask questions in that moment while something is happening. How do we do practice with something like this? Do I coach the learners through it? Do I sit on Zoom and watch them do it? Or do I have them record videos and then provide feedback on it asynchronously later on, just as a practice activity even? Do I give them supports for it and just ask them to do little bits? Do I engage them in peer feedback on it so that they serve as models and coaches for each other? Because I might have some students in the class who are already doing quite well, and I can buddy people up. Do you choose your breakout rooms in that way so that you are matching up your students who are going to be more sophisticated and already at the level of articulation and reflection with some of the students who need somebody else to be modeling that for them and coaching it along the way? I see we have a question about, wouldn't your target audience essentially dictate how you build the course? How do you begin developing a course for a wider audience than your initial target? Well, yes, your target audience does dictate how you build your course, but within any group of learners who we get into a course, there can be a wide range of entry knowledge and abilities. Even to say like, oh, well, they're all high school graduates, but they didn't actually all have the same high school experience and they didn't all learn the same things. If we're embedded within a curriculum that has multiple courses that are building toward a certification or a degree, ideally, those are all building and taught consistently, no matter who has taught the courses. But in practice, that doesn't always happen. So again, we can get a wide range of students. Vygotsky talked about the zone of proximal development, the ZPD, which you may or may not have heard of before. And the idea of that is that there's this optimal place where learning takes place. It is neither too easy nor too difficult for learners. It's just enough of a stretch. It's just enough of a challenge for them that they're going to get engaged in the process. Because, if something's too easy, we just check out. We say, I don't need that. But if it's too hard, we give up. We say, oh, that's impossible. I can't do that. So ideally, we identify that spot that's right where the learner is. In your classes, if you've just been teaching where you're disseminating information to your learners. And if you have a big class, this is what happens a lot because you don't have time to engage with everybody individually. What you often find out is that there were some students who did really well in the course, but they kind of checked out because they didn't feel the need to be there. They were meeting their own needs. And then there are going to be some learners who are coming out at the bottom who really struggled no matter what they did. If you spend time talking to them, you often find out that they didn't have all of the prerequisite knowledge and skills in the class. And because they didn't have that foundational stuff, the stuff at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, then when we were doing other activities in the class that were application activities or analysis activities, they didn't understand what was happening. So the class kept moving forward and they didn't move forward. It was, outside of their zone of proximity. And this is a problem that really runs across education, across all institutions. So we can build for a target audience, but we still never know exactly who we get there. And not everybody's going to be exactly alike. But I like to think about this cognitive apprenticeship model in terms of like, where am I going to be giving learning information to my students, so the reception learning component of it, or where do I need to push them to now really start thinking for themselves? And that's going to be starting to get into those higher order skills with metacognition. And then this idea of exploration, which is when you can really own and extend the knowledge on your own, that matches up very nicely with creating, sitting up at the top of Bloom's taxonomy. So it's the highest order of skills. And this kind of goes back a bit to that question we had about activities and the relationship to assessment a second ago, which is that we can have activities that have an indirect relationship to assessment. So they could be just practice activities or explorations of an overall topic. And then we can have the ones that are directly connected into them. And so we might have students doing performances or critiques or debriefs, and the activity itself is what will be assessed. It's what they produce, and that's what we're going to work through for an assessment. So I'm starting to wrap this up and get to where we're going to do some Q&A, but I want to bring us back one more time to Bloom's taxonomy, and I'm going to talk over this. And if you've got some concrete ideas right now, drop these into the chat, please. It's like, so what would we do in an online class to teach the lower order skills? Some of the things I immediately think about is, well, if I need my students to be able to remember or to understand something, that'd be a great opportunity for me to use the quiz function that's in my learning management system. Like I said a little bit earlier, like having a discussion about that may not be the most robust thing to do. It may not make sense, but I could build self-check quizzes for my students, or maybe they're going to be graded. And so they can practice with the ideas and see if they are correctly recalling and understanding the facts and ideas that are in the class. If I'm teaching to my students, I might have videos that are presenting the information to them. But again, I'm probably not getting deeply into discussion. Now, if the entirety of my class is focused on this remember and understand stuff, what's challenging for me is that I don't have points of human interaction built in for my learners. It's not necessary from a pedagogical standpoint, but it may be necessary from a motivational standpoint. It's really difficult to get students to just push through stuff on their own. And there are some really great tools out there that we can use. We could get into, doing Nearpods and Ed puzzles. If you've never checked those out before, they're kind of fun for, getting folks more actively involved. And you can have little bits of video or slides and lecture interspersed with practice opportunities for the students. Again, that's getting at learner content and learner computer interaction. It's not really learner instructor or learner peer interaction that's taking place there. And I see somebody put in the chat too about having embedded questions and videos, making the students ask questions. It's a lot better than just disseminating a lot of information at them. Having opportunities to also engage with these students could be important for the ones who are going to be struggling. And I see we've got a question here about, how do we build in the additional learning for the ones who are struggling? Well, we've got to be able to identify those learners. And sometimes we do need to interact with them one-on-one to find out why they're struggling with it. I had a student once who was a math teacher tell me about her struggles with a student who could not identify right triangles. And she talked to the class about it all the time. The book talked about right triangles, and the student was sometimes getting them correct and sometimes getting them incorrect on the test. And it wasn't until she sat down and had a conversation with the student. And by sat down and had a conversation with the student, I meant sat down and didn't talk at the student, but listened to the student and said, tell me what makes this one a right triangle. Okay. Tell me what makes this one not a right triangle. And didn't pass judgment. That she learned that the student was identifying right triangles as triangles that point to the right, which may be a subjective judgment at that, right? Because which way does a triangle point? It's something tricky to figure out there. We move up to the middle order skills, right? So we want students to be able to apply something, or we want them to be able to analyze something. What are the kinds of things that we might do in an online class, and how do we support them with the different tools? If I want my students to apply something, this is where, if it's a hands-on thing that I need them to demonstrate, I might get them to take a video of it. I could use the tool I mentioned before called Flipgrid and have them put their videos in there, and they could give each other video feedback on it, or I could give them feedback on it. It could be done on a discussion board and people are, but you have to be careful that you don't have everybody trying to solve the same problem, because if you have 20 people trying to do the same thing, the first person will do it and then nobody else is motivated to do it. One of the things I like to do in online classes then is get students to come up with an example or come up with a problem, and then they post that for the class. That's step one. And then a peer has to come in and try to solve the problem or deconstruct the example that has been presented to them. And then somebody else can come in, and we can even get into the higher order skills here and get into evaluating, and they can evaluate how effective that solution was. And so now I'm building in a lot of peer interaction and also making the opportunity for the instructor to get in and interact with students around all this. There's also that opportunity, if we go back to the kinds of interactions that I talked about at the beginning, to have some networked interactions occurring. So my students could go out and be pulling things from different online resources and from other people and situations that they know outside of the class. And when we're all online, it's so easy to link all of that in. It's very easy to enable places in our tools for students to freely share in ways that they just don't when we have face-to-face classes. You know, like I'll have students who find a video, and rather than sharing it directly with the class, they'll send me a link to it on Saturday night. And then maybe I remember to bring it to class, and maybe I do or don't have time to play it in class. But if there's a place for them to share these kinds of resources that they're finding with the rest of the class, then everybody could benefit from these things. And actually, if we don't create those spaces, you know what our students do? They back channel it with each other. That's not entirely a bad thing, but the one bad part about it is if you've ever had the situation where you gave a test and a whole bunch of people got the same wrong answer, and you got kind of puzzled by it until you realized that they all were using the same incorrect online resource to help them. If you know what they're accessing, it's a lot easier to tell them, yeah, that one's bad. Don't go there. Look at this one instead. And you can use those ones that are not great resources to engage in some of these higher order skills too, like have them evaluate the resources if that is pertinent to the learning objectives that you are working with. So I'm not going to spend more of my time just talking at you. I'd love to be able to talk with you and answer questions. And but hopefully I've given you a little something to think about with structuring between higher, middle, and lower order skills.
Thank you so much, Dr. Denon. We just have a few questions out here. So one of the questions is, how do we help learners who are struggling on a given topic in self-paced learning when there is no instructor in real time?
That is a really challenging thing to do. One thing I encourage people to do is to, at regular points in their classes, if you're in charge of the design yourself, put something in, put in a line that says, are you satisfied with your performance? Are you struggling with this concept? If so, contact me and have a link to your email, or set up periodic synchronous sessions and encourage students to show up to them that don't necessarily have an agenda, but you could ask your students to send you their muddiest point questions in advance. And I realize it's self-paced, but still we usually have like a number of people who are going through, and sometimes people are craving interaction. I'm finding in this moment that like my office hours are having more people show up than ever before. I've gone through years of nobody shows up to office hours, and suddenly they're showing up just because they want that greater connection with their class and with the people in their class. But having that, self-paced is great, but there's a point where it has to stop being just a person in isolation, and they have to have access to the instructor. The other thing is that we can monitor and we can do regular check-ins. You can use the quiz function to build in surveys and ask students to rate themselves periodically so that the instructor can see it. You can ask them, like, how well do you feel you're understanding the course material? Do you feel that that's reflected in the scores you've been receiving, in the course so far? What questions do you have at this time? But it does have to funnel back to a human being who can then interact with them.
Thank you for that answer. And there's another question that has come up. Somebody has a very mixed class. So she asked, what do you feel is the best way that 20-something-year-olds learn online?
Um, you know, I think that once we're getting into adults, I'm like, we're out of high school, we're adults. There are really more similarities than there are differences in terms of how learners learn. Where the biggest differences tend to lie are in their life circumstances, so that if you get people who are what we would consider non-traditional students or slightly older students, they might have more life obligations, household obligations, other things that are distracting them from doing their work, and it's more difficult than if you have students who are 19 years old showing up full time on a college campus, and that's what they're there to do 100% of the time. So with that in mind, being a little more flexible for people can help them. Inviting them to get involved. Now, I don't want to play into the digital natives myth, because it really is a myth. Not everybody who is 20 is supremely technologically adept. And furthermore, I say this with great confidence. I've spent a lot of time researching teenagers in the last few years. Just because they know their way around Snapchat like nobody's business does not mean that they understand how to use any of these teaching and learning tools that we use better than anybody else. Does not mean that they know how to do they can find out stuff online about their favorite celebrities, but they can't necessarily find and assess for accuracy the academic information that they need to find. But getting them involved in the learning process, I think, is really good. If you're talking about 20 somethings, a lot of them have done a lot of collaborative experiences coming up through schooling. They are used to working in groups. They might moan at that because everybody does a little bit, but giving them voice in the class, giving them a chance to feel seen and heard, that will help increase their sense of community, increase their motivation, and hopefully engage them in the class.
Thank
But
you.
there's a lot of fatigue right now going on with all of this, because a lot of our students, if they're full-time students, they've been used to showing up and sliding into the seat in the classroom and then seeing what happens, and it's all very reactive to what happens. But they get up and stretch in between all of it. And I don't know about you all. I sit in this chair all day long on Zoom right now. And it gets old sitting here on Zoom. And I'm thinking it's the same thing for our students. So we do need to be mindful of that.
And another question that was asked earlier is if you can address how poorly many K-12 students perform in the pandemic.
Yeah. And so K-12 right now, K-12 has a lot of challenges. K-12 serves so many functions. It's not just learning and meeting the standards. But there are the social functions that it serves for these children. There are, the social service functions that it's serving for these children. It's a daycare function for a lot of families. We've asked K-12 to be all sorts of things, and then all of a sudden we just changed everything about it all at once. The kids don't necessarily have self-regulation skills already. Those are skills that ideally would be built through the middle school years and the high school years. But we know by the time we get them to university that those students, a lot of them don't yet have those good self-regulation skills, and they struggle their first year or two of university when they find out that their instructors are not going to ask them 5 times to turn in the late assignment. And instead are just going to be like, yeah, whatever, you didn't turn it in. So, that's a problem. They're used to a teacher who's right there, who can see that they look confused or they're not doing the work, and who intervenes. And instead they're sitting alone on a computer somewhere else. Maybe they have, a parent or a relative or older sibling, grandparent who's there, who's able to help them when they're learning remotely, but maybe not. And the degree to which they can be helped with that is, who knows. The tools that they're using are not always the best tools to be used in those situations, but it's what they've got. The teachers have had to learn very quickly how to get things up and running, and it's not always smooth. Kids get so worried about things like the rule compliance that it's hard for them to focus on the learning. Like, I'm supposed to be here at this time with my camera on, and oh, my Wi-Fi went down for a second and I missed something, and what do I do? And I have to, do I have to email the teacher about this? How do I email the teacher? Do I type it in the chat? Oh, other people are typing song lyrics endlessly in the chat. What do we do? Like, it's kind of chaotic for a lot of them. There is, I've seen coming up in our chat here things about, like spending time teaching people the LMS and what's expected. Yeah, that's necessary to make all of that work. Kids are home alone. Yep. And it's hard to get some of them to do it. Jennifer's got a middle schooler, so do I. I've been pleased because my daughter is learning self-regulation skills this year, like really thriving with it, but I could see just how easily it could go the other end if you don't have that sense of self-discipline. The younger kids, I think it's, so Zachary's got a second grader. Oh, that one is really rough. And I know that those teachers are struggling with things like, how do I do, normally if I'm teaching kids how to write and I'm doing those psychomotor skills, this is how we do it, but I can't reach out to them through a Zoom and make that happen. There's so many layers to all of this. And in the spring, a lot of people gave up. And so we had that. And then the summer, and there's a backslide that happens during that time. We know about that. That happens every summer where there's a backslide in things like reading skills in particular, also mathematics skills. And the beginning of the school year is used to bring students up to speed. And that's why some places even go to year-round schooling where breaks just happen for, like a week at a time every month and a half, because you avoid having the backslide. But now, as we're trying to get things, back in order and still struggling to find students, to make sure the students are really there and on camera and engaged, and struggling with, do they know how to use the technology before we can even interact with them effectively? We're backsliding more for some of these kids. So yeah, divide is getting bigger, and it's been a hot topic for me, so I'm ranting on it, but it's been a huge concern. I think that some of that happens at the higher ed level as well. But we don't focus on it quite as much because higher ed isn't mandatory. People can step off of that all the time, and we don't think so much about the consequences of it.
And a last question, which was asked earlier, was what's the difference between an activity and an assessment?
And so the activity is what we do during a class to learn something and to practice something. And the assessment is what we do when we actually, determine whether or not this thing was learned and give feedback. Now, an assessment, of course, can be formative or it can be summative. So there can be assessment on a learning activity that doesn't yield a grade necessarily, because it could just be a formative assessment. And then we decide that, okay, you seem to know enough on this, so we can move to the next topic. Or I need you to practice some more on this. That's just a formative assessment. Or it could be a summative assessment like a test or a paper. It's a final product. You turned it in and the grade stands, whatever you did on this. Hopefully we have enough activities, whether they involve learner content, learner computer, learner instructor interaction, that we have enough of those kinds of interactions taking place through activities that learners attain the learning objectives. And if the activity is not the same thing as the assessment, that they will perform satisfactorily on the assessment and demonstrate that they have attained the learning objectives. Instructional alignment, so important.
Of course, as always, all throughout. So on this note, I'm keeping cognizant of time, and I know everybody has to jump on to other meetings. But before we end, I would just like to thank everybody for joining us on today's webinar. And thank you all for your time, your questions, and mostly for your active participation in this webinar. Our next webinar will be on January 26th at 2 p.m. So we'd request all of you to get this on your calendar. We'll be sending out the invites later on. The topic for our next webinar is enhancing learner engagement through the use of immersive learning strategies. In this topic, it will help you enhance learner engagement, improve the learner's activities, demonstrate the application of content by integrating the learner and the content with authentic real-world situations. So we look forward to your participation on our next webinar. So thank you, Dr. Denon, once again for your time for this webinar, and we so appreciate you being here. And thank you, everyone. And have a great rest of your day. And we look forward to meeting you all very soon next year. So I hope this is a good wrap to 2020, and we'll see you all in the next year. Happy 2021. Bye, everybody.
Good evening, everyone.